Have you ever wondered how far someone can go to hide their darkest secrets? When we think of marriage, we imagine love, companionship, and a shared life. But what if I told you that behind a perfect facade, there could be a sinister plot that ends in betrayal and death? In this episode, we'll uncover a story that challenges everything you believe to be true about trust and love, revealing the terrifying price one might pay when all that's left is desperation. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will make you question just how far a person can go to cover up their lies. The dense fog covered Lake Coeur d'Alene on that cold February morning. The silence was broken only by the subtle sound of water against the hull of the boat as Larry and Lori Eisenberg floated slowly on the vast expanse of water. The rising sun barely managed to penetrate the mist, creating an atmosphere of total isolation. Lori, her brown eyes fixed on the horizon, observed what should have been a moment of peace beside her husband. But something was terribly wrong. Larry, a 68-year-old man, no longer seemed the same. His once vibrant face was pale, and his movements, once firm, were now uncertain and hesitant. "I feel strange," Larry commented, his voice trembling. He stood up abruptly, something Lori did not overlook as she watched his every move with heightened attention. She saw him walk towards the motor, swaying slightly as if he were about to lose his balance. "What are you doing?" Lori asked, her voice tinged with a concern she couldn't completely hide. Larry looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion. "Something's wrong with the motor," he murmured, leaning over the panel to inspect the equipment. It was then that the nightmare began. Without any warning, Larry stumbled backward, as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Lori screamed and rushed toward him, but before she could reach him, he had already fallen into the icy water. The sound of Larry's body hitting the surface was muffled by the dense fog surrounding them. Lori froze for a second, her mind trying to process what had just happened. She looked around frantically, trying to spot Larry in the water, but all she could see was the distorted reflection of the dawn on the surface. "Larry!" she screamed, her voice breaking in the fog that seemed to smother it. The silence that followed was deafening, almost cruel. She knew that every second counted, but her hands were trembling so much that she could barely think clearly. She ran to the cabin, frantically searching for the phone. All she could think was that she needed to call for help, but where was the damn phone? Lori rummaged through the interior of the boat, her hands pulling cushions, opening compartments, knocking objects to the floor, but there was no sign of the device. Time seemed to drag on, each heartbeat echoing in her ears like a drum. The absence of Larry in the water, the emptiness around her, all contributed to the growing terror consuming her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lori found the phone tucked under one of the seats. Her trembling fingers barely managed to dial the emergency number. When the operator answered, Lori could hardly form coherent words. Her voice choked with fear and anguish. "My husband. He fell into the water. He had a stroke. I can't find him," she cried, almost hysterically, as she tried to explain the situation. But the desperation in her voice made it difficult for the operator to understand what was happening. The boat, now adrift, slowly spun on the lake as Lori continued to shout Larry's name, hoping for a response that never came. Welcome to Spooky Stories. I'm Milo, your guide through the chilling and the unknown. Here, we dive into terrifying tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join our community of thrill seekers, and let's explore the darkness together. If you're curious about how I keep my concentration, efficiency, performance, and mental health at their peak every day, I'm going to share with you 2 resources that I use daily in my video creation routine. First, breathing for sleep. This method is essential for my deep, restful nights, ensuring I wake up refreshed and ready to create high-quality content. And the best part? It's super easy to incorporate into your routine. And then there's the 7 seconds at-home ritual. This ritual is backed by 4 neuroscience studies and helps to supercharge my brain power, keeping my focus sharp throughout the entire day. Want to try these resources and feel the difference in your routine? The links are right here in the video description and pinned in the comments. Don't miss this chance to elevate your productivity and mental well-being. The silence of the lake contrasted violently with Lori's inner chaos. She stood at the bow of the boat, her eyes fixed on the water, as if at any moment Larry would emerge, pulling himself out of the icy abyss. The radio, still tuned to the emergency frequency, emitted static and fragments of conversations from the rescuers who were on their way. But Lori barely listened, her mind trapped in the last image of Larry disappearing into the dark water. Time seemed to have distorted, minutes dragging on like hours, as she waited, not knowing what else to do. She had tried to maneuver the boat, to steer it back to the area where Larry had fallen, but nothing seemed right. The mental confusion that consumed her made it difficult to make rational decisions. The only thing that kept her in control was the need not to lose sight of the spot where he had gone under. "I can't leave you, Larry," she whispered to herself, as her body shook with cold and fear. Finally, the distant sound of an engine broke the silence. A rescue boat appeared in the fog, slowly approaching. Lori waved frantically, trying to get the rescuers' attention. When the boat got closer, 2 officers helped her board the rescue vessel. Her movements were automatic, as if she were in a trance. "Please, find my husband," she pleaded as she was wrapped in a warm blanket. The leader of the rescue team, a man with a deep voice and a steady gaze, asked quick questions while Lori tried, between sobs, to describe what had happened. He kept his voice calm, trying to soothe her and obtain useful information. But Lori's panic made her repeat herself, the same phrases blending together in her mind. "He was sick. He was acting strange. He just fell. I tried, but I couldn't reach him." Her words dissolved into tears as the rescuers looked at the dark water, knowing that the chances of finding Larry alive were almost non-existent. While the rescuers worked, Lori was taken to the shore, where she would be attended to by paramedics. She felt lost, not knowing what to do or where to go. The officers' questions barely penetrated. Hours later, on the shore of the lake, Lori was approached by one of the officers. He observed her with a clinical eye, analyzing every movement, every expression. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened, Lori," he said, trying to sound as empathetic as possible. Lori, now wrapped in a blanket, still trembled, but this time not just from the cold. Something in her mind tormented her, an uneasiness she tried desperately to hide. "I've already told you everything I know," Lori replied, her voice weak and trembling. But the officer was not convinced. He continued to ask questions, pressing her on the details. "How did you get the bloody nose? Lori hesitated for a moment, her eyes drifting to the ground. I fell trying to reach him. I hit the boat, she finally replied. But the officer noticed the inconsistency in her narrative. You said he fell after you tried to help him? But then how did you get the nosebleed before he fell into the water? Lori felt the heat rise in her face, the pressure of the questions beginning to tighten like a noose around her neck. I don't know. Maybe it was after. I don't remember clearly, she stammered. The officer wrote something in his notebook, his face expressionless. He then asked a question Lori didn't expect. Do you have any idea where he might be now? Any specific point in the lake? Lori shook her head, but the truth was she had an idea, a dark instinct that something was very wrong, but she dared not say. Time passed and the search for Larry continued. The authorities began to suspect that the case was not just an accident, but they still didn't have enough evidence to confirm their suspicions. Lori's behavior, her evasive answers, everything was being carefully analyzed. She realized the days dragged on as authorities expanded the search for Larry. The case quickly gained local attention, with reporters camped near the lake and helicopters flying overhead, hoping to capture any glimpse of what might have happened. Lori, for her part, stayed home, avoiding the cameras and the curious gaze of the community. Suspicions began to spread, and people who once knew her began to wonder if she was really telling the truth. It was during one of those days that Lori received an unexpected visit. A group of officers arrived at her home with a search warrant. "We're here to investigate your husband's disappearance," said the lead officer, his voice firm but respectful. Lori tried to keep her composure, but she felt her heart race in her chest. They searched every corner of the house, looking for anything that might link Lori to Larry's disappearance. In the kitchen, they found an almost empty naked juice bottle, the same one Lori had taken to the boat that morning. One of the officers smelled the bottle, his face contorting slightly. "It smells like medicine," he murmured to his colleague, but it was in the shed outside where they made the most disturbing discovery. A red stain, still wet, hidden under a wooden plank. "This looks like blood," commented one of the officers, his words hitting the silence like a blow. Lori watched everything, a sense of dread creeping over her. It's with stain," she tried to justify, but the officers' looks showed skepticism. They collected samples for analysis, while Lori watched, knowing she was being trapped in a web she had woven herself. Meanwhile, news of the forensic investigation quickly spread through the community. Doubts about Lori's innocence grew, and those who knew her began to recall details that once seemed insignificant. Finally, after weeks of searching, the divers found Larry's body, floating lifelessly near the shore of the lake. The news spread like wildfire through the small community, and mourning took hold of everyone. But there was something even darker in the discovery. Larry's body showed signs that he had not died from drowning. The authorities decided to keep the autopsy results secret for the time being, but rumors began to circulate. When Lori was called to identify the body, the tension in the air was palpable. "It's him," she said, her voice emotionless. But inside, Lori was in pieces. She knew time was running out, that the pieces of the puzzle were coming together and pointing directly at her. The officer accompanying her watched her reactions closely, noting every expression, every word. Meanwhile, the investigation into Lori's finances took an even more alarming turn. It was discovered that she had embezzled a significant amount of money from the organization she worked for, something Larry likely never knew. Authorities began to connect the dots. The financial pressure, Lori's strange behavior, the recent changes in Larry's will favoring Lori's children. Everything indicated that Lori had a clear motive to get rid of her husband. However, Lori still maintained a facade of innocence, claiming it was all just a terrible accident. But the investigators were not convinced. The juice bottle found in Lori's home was being analyzed in the lab, and the results were about to reveal a dark secret. As she waited, the lab results finally arrived, and with them the last piece of the puzzle. The juice Lori had taken to the boat that morning contained a lethal dose of diphenhydramine, a powerful sedative that, in excess, could cause unconsciousness and even death. The same drug was found in large quantities in Larry's body during the autopsy. To the investigators, the conclusion was clear. Lori had poisoned her husband before throwing him into the water, staging the incident as a tragic accident. With this new evidence in hand, authorities wasted no time in arresting Lori. She was taken into custody, her expression a mask of resignation. In court, as the prosecutors laid out the case, Lori remained silent, refusing to make any statement that could incriminate her further. However, her defense was weak in the face of overwhelming evidence linking her to Larry's murder. During the trial, friends and family testified, revealing details about Lori and Larry's relationship that were previously unknown. Small hints of tension, arguments about money, and even sudden changes in Lori's behavior in the days leading up to Larry's death were brought to light. Each testimony was a blow to Lori's attempt to maintain her innocence. Finally, after weeks of trial, the verdict was delivered. Lori was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to a long prison term. The case, which had begun as a tragic accident on a lake, turned out to be one of the most cold-blooded and calculated crimes in the small community's history. And as Lori was led away to serve her sentence, the residents of Coeur d'Alene knew they would never forget the story of the woman who killed her husband to cover up her own crimes. Thus, Lake Coeur d'Alene, once a place of peace and tranquility, became a dark symbol of how greed and desperation can drive a person. After hearing this disturbing story, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people around you? Are we ready to face the darkest truths that might be hidden beneath the surface of relationships we deem safe? What would you do if you were in Larry's or Lori's place? It's time to reflect on the choices we make and the people we trust. Now, I challenge you to apply what you've learned today. Pay closer attention to the details, trust your instincts, and don't ignore the warning signs. And if you want to keep exploring stories that will challenge your beliefs and make you question reality, subscribe now to the Spooky Stories channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the upcoming episodes, because what you discover might change your life forever.